All right, 8th grade teachers, let's go ahead and get started. If you haven't downloaded the documents behind each of these buttons, go ahead and do so. Push pause and go ahead and do so before we get started. All right, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and click in and go into the test item specifications that are of the standards, the content standards for the first 9 weeks. You'll notice that I did not include the end standards or nature of science standards, and it isn't because they're not important. They're really important. But I believe that the content standards would be the ones that would influence us the most in figuring out a candidate phenomenon to present into our classrooms. The nature of science standards, they're going to be what we utilize in pulling out all of the science we can during that time period where we're utilizing the phenomenon. So for instance, the practice of science and the characteristics of scientific knowledge is definitely going to be coming out as we get our kids involved in solving the mystery of that phenomenon. The role of theories, laws, and hypotheses, and the use of models, of course, are going to be part of that. So that's the nature of science, and that will have its place as it is in our curriculum maps. But let's use these content standards to influence us in the development of candidate phenomenon. So getting started, you may be familiar with the naming conventions of the benchmark, but I'm going to go over them very briefly. The SC means science. The 8 is grade 8. The P is the reporting category or the body of knowledge, in this case physical science. There's also E for earth science, L for life science, and then N, of course, for nature of science. The 8 stands for the big idea because the bodies of knowledge are further broken down into big ideas, and in this case this is properties of matter, and the 5 is the benchmark. So going through this particular benchmark, if you go into your curriculum map, you'll notice this isn't the first one that's noted. The first one that's actually listed is the SC8P 8.7, but this one's up here and we don't have 8.7. Why don't we? Because this is what we call an annually assessed essential standard, and down here you'll see the 8.7 is also one of the ones that is assessed it's also assessed utilizing the content limits and specifications of this particular standard. So this is kind of the parent standard, and this, because of its relatedness, is also grouped in underneath here. So we're dealing with the exploring the scientific theory of atoms, also known as atomic theory, by recognizing that atoms are the smallest unit of an element and are composed of subatomic particles, electrons surrounding a nucleus containing protons and neutrons. When you go down here and you see benchmark clarifications, when you read through these are to explain how the achievement of the benchmark will be demonstrated by students. These are clarification statements that are written for the benchmark and how also the benchmark will be assessed. Test writers utilize these when they were writing the assessment, the state assessment. So this is kind of like a glimpse to look in as to what would be asked of our students. These are really important to keep in mind because this is all what students will have to do. Moving down into content limits. The content limits here have this further clarification of what we're supposed to teach and what we're not supposed to teach. So we'll never have to teach about chemical bonding. Can you? Of course you can if you've done everything minimally that you're supposed to so far. You don't have to teach them about valence electrons and electron configurations. Make sure you teach what you're supposed to teach. That is in that's in the benchmark clarifications. But when we get to content limits, this helps us understand what is specifically we're supposed to teach and what we're not supposed to teach. Stimulus attributes, these are like different types of stimulus materials that they may use in the test. So for instance, an example is there's an 8th grade standard that deals with temperature, and there's a further clarification here in stimulus attributes, meaning that they will only portray the measurement of temperature on the test in Celsius. They won't show it in Fahrenheit, so you need to make sure that examples you give your students would be in degrees Celsius. This we didn't have any stimulus attributes on this particular standard, so I just thought I'd give you one as an example. The response attributes, those define characteristics of the options from which a student must choose to answer the question on the state assessment. So prior knowledge, this is nice to know on what grade levels, grade 5, and some related content that they may have been exposed to before they got to your class. It also tells you that if you're an 8th grade teacher, this hasn't been since 5th grade. Some items do have sample items released. Keep in mind, these were once on the state assessment and now they've been released because they weren't great performers on the state assessment. Back to the top, because also on this is a related standard that's also on the first DIA, and that's 8.6. Recognize that elements are grouped in the periodic table according to similarities of their properties. This is the first DIA content, and then this is all falling during 8.5, and you won't see 8.5 until you get to DIA 2. And when you get to DIA 2, you will have 8.9 and 8.8 also on that DIA. So you can see this one particular page of the test item specifications and all this clarification and all these content limits hit most of the first 9 weeks. The next one, that you'll see that it has a 7 in here, meaning a 7th grade standard in an 8th grade classroom. Well, actually it's for the SC8E510, which is also part of DIA 1. For further clarification, how we've put it in context is we'll have to go to the curriculum app itself. But before we do that, make sure you go through all of these content limits and stimulus attributes and benchmark clarifications, and make sure you get to know these standards. What's going to happen is hopefully some sort of inspiration in thinking of what a phenomenon could be that potentially spreads the span of the whole 9 weeks. That's the goal. If it's not something that's feasible, then potentially one of these standards or two of these standards itself could lend itself to a phenomenon. Just something to think about as we get into this. But let's get back to the curriculum app. Okay, let's go to the curriculum app. Now I know you're familiar with the curriculum app, but we're going to make sure that you understand that when we unpacked the standards on the curriculum app, that we couldn't put everything that was in the specs items. And so, for instance, when you see the teacher hints and instructional focus, you'll see some of the verbiage right from the specs document, but not everything. Due to space and format, we couldn't get everything on the curriculum app. So it's important to make sure that when we go through the specs document first, and then we go through the curriculum app to see how the standard is unpacked further. So anyway, this is an important step in doing this process. The science practices is another part that is going to be important to consider when we're looking at a candidate phenomenon. And just a reminder that 8 of them are explained on page 9 of all curriculum apps, but you have a link here. When you go to the QR code, there's a video from Paul Anderson of Bozeman Science to give you even further clarification. But you want to start thinking of what are we going to have our students do when they're trying to figure out this phenomenon. Now we know part of our repertoire is developing and using models. We're going to have them developing initial thinking models all the time now. And part of that leads them to asking questions. So we can get that driving question board written. And with that, they'll probably be defining their own problems that they need to solve. That leads to potentially having them carry out their own investigations and plan those, or you plan them and they do them, but then they're going to be analyzing and interpreting data so that they can make some sort of a claim. And when they make a claim, they'll be engaging in argument from evidence to verify or to support their claim. So there's a lot of potential here in all of these 8 practices. And I strongly encourage you to get to know them deeply so that in the course of one whole 9 weeks that they've had exposure to most of, not all of them, multiple times. And that will definitely help them dive deeper into learning about all the new phenomena that's going to hit them in the classroom. And lastly, back to the the Canvas page, but the candidate phenomenon template is here located for your use, because keep in mind when you get to the next page after you've gone through the deep analysis of the standards, this is the Padlet that I was referring to. Here you'll post your idea. Don't be apprehensive about this. Just throw ideas out there. If you want to use that document to upload, that'd be a way that you can post even more, and then this doesn't get too cluttered. Remember the directions that were in the previous video on how to utilize this, and I really cannot wait to see what's being all the collaboration that's going to happen on this Padlet. So good luck to everybody, and I can't wait to see it.